In the mid-1970s, young women were being taken from the leafy streets of suburban New Jersey.
She heard a female voice from the back of the car crying out, "Help me, he's crazy."
Their abductor, a master of manipulation.
You would think he was the sweetest person in the world. He would charm you to death.
With murder in mind.
Their stockings were tied around their neck with a stick in the stocking to twist it, to make it tighter and tighter.
It was horrendous and something which has stuck with me forever.
But what was the root of his brutal ferocity?
From the time he was in high school, his crimes were directed against women.
He's missing compassion and humanity.
And was he born to kill? In the 1970s, New Jersey's affluent Bergen County, to the west of Manhattan, was an idyllic place to live for thousands of New York's professionals.
A very nice suburban community directly over the George Washington Bridge from New York City.
Very nice middle-class residential community. About half of the people there commuted to New York to work, and the other half worked locally.
For former Bergen County prosecutor Charles Buckley, the area was at odds with its crime-ridden neighbor across the Hudson River.
There was never anything criminal happening in the area. I mean, there were no break-ins going on at the time. I don't remember a concern about safety at your home. It was very quiet.
But Buckley would soon be called in to work a case that would rock the community to its core. In 1975, the genteel district of Haworth had seemed an ideal location for British newlyweds Jonathan and Susan Haynes to set up home. Jonathan had recently taken up a job in the US. Susan, an accomplished midwife, was looking for work.
We had the option of having an apartment in New York or moving out into New Jersey, and we drove around New Jersey and northern Bergen County. It was particularly lovely, and we picked a house, and it was a nice house.
The tranquil suburb appeared to offer the perfect start in life for Jonathan and his new bride.
We met at a party, and we hit it off almost straight away. She was fairly beautiful, so that was a good eye contact, I guess. She was a very happy girl, hugely warm, always had a smile, and very social, lots and lots of friends, made friends very, very easily.
On the morning of October the 6th, Jonathan headed off to work, leaving Susan at home.
I telephoned Sue at about 1 o'clock, and everything was fine, and she was quite excited that she'd had a letter from good friends in Cape Town. One of the great friends was going to have a child. She was excited by that, and so we chatted for some length of time about that. I said, I think I'll be home slightly late tonight.
Jonathan arrived back in Bergen County just before 6 p.m.
Her husband came home from work that day. He had every anticipation that she would be there.
Normally, Sue would always come to the door and say hi. But there was no one there. The house was locked, so I had to use my keys to get in. I shouted, "Sue, Sue, Sue."
There was not a thing out of place. He looked into every room in the house and found nothing.
The house was in perfect shape. Things were folded neatly as he expected.
There was no flower pots knocked over. There was just nothing there to suggest there would have been a struggle or anything like that.
Jonathan went to their garage to check on Susan's car.
The car was shut, but the driver's keys were on the ignition, I believe, and the house keys were on the passenger seat.
So that's the first indication that there was a problem at this house. His wife was gone, and there was no reason, no note.
The police were called, and the young husband soon found himself a suspect.
In any case of a missing woman, the first person that a police officer will think of as a possible perpetrator is the spouse or boyfriend.
My friend suggested that things might not be as they seem to the police, and then it dawned on me that I might well be a suspect.
After 3 days with still no sight of Susan, the young Englishman was asked to take a polygraph test.
The results of a lie detector test are not admissible in evidence in any court of law, but they are an important investigative tool for law enforcement.
I had no idea what a polygraph test was. I wouldn't want to do it again under any sort of circumstances like that.
More than a third of female murder victims are killed by their husband or boyfriend, but not Susan Haynes.
Haynes passed the lie detector test with flying colors. There was absolutely no concern that he was involved in this disappearance whatsoever.
Jonathan's new wife had seemingly vanished off the face of the earth.
They did searches of the area, the wooded areas and fields around the Haynes home. They brought in sniffing dogs.
The police decided that they would like to use a psychic to help on the investigation. And I travelled for days in an unmarked police van with police going around New Jersey trying to find indications of where Susan might have been.
Hundreds of volunteers went forth marching arm in arm over cleared areas to see if they could come across any sort of evidence whatsoever. Nothing turned up whatsoever.
Everybody was trying to help to come up with some understanding what might have happened to Susan. Was she wandering around America with a complete loss of memory? Had she been kidnapped by a professional body? Because at that time, the United Kingdom was having trouble in Northern Ireland.
Is there a ransom call? Is this a nonsensical ransom situation? They just don't know. There's nothing to work on. You have to have some clue, some sense of direction as to where this is leading.
As commuters continued to cross the George Washington Bridge to make their mark in New York, one local remained in the area. Charismatic, privileged, Robert Reldon.
He was a charming guy. Handsome, tall, powerfully built, personable.
He was very good looking. He spoke well. He didn't cuss. He didn't swear.
Women loved him. They were all over Robert Reldon. He had girlfriends here, girlfriends there.
If you saw him walking down the street and he asked for directions, you'd certainly stop. You wouldn't think twice about helping him out.
Reldon had been born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1940, before his family relocated to Bergen County.
Reldon came from a good family. His mother and father owned a luncheonette coffee shop in New York City. He may have not had much parental supervision because both mother and father worked in the restaurant.
Although Robert was close to his busy parents, when they did get time off work, much of their focus had to be devoted to Robert's sibling.
Reldon had a younger sister, Susan, and the younger sister had polio as a child. And the parents' attention was turned toward the younger sister.
However, Reldon didn't lack for material goods.
The aunt was very wealthy, Aunt Lillian. She had married well and done well herself financially.
Lillian Booth was the sister of Robert Reldon's mother. She was an aspiring actress in New York City. But like most young, struggling actors, she had to find other work while she was waiting for her big break on Broadway. And so she worked in the luncheonette. A very wealthy gentleman came into the luncheonette and took a liking to her. He was the son of an early investor in IBM and had inherited a great deal of wealth. Lillian and he were a happily married couple. They had no children of their own, and so Lillian focused a lot of her attention on Robert Reldon, whom she called Bobby, and all of the other nieces and nephews that she had in the extended family. Bobby Reldon was her favorite, and she lavished gifts on him. One of the particularly nice gifts was a brand new Volkswagen convertible.
But Aunt Lillian's favorite nephew was not all he seemed. On October the 6th, 1975, 28-year-old newlywed Susan Haynes had mysteriously disappeared from her home in leafy Bergen County, New Jersey, leaving police and her husband baffled.
I just couldn't imagine at the time what had happened. I guess desperation sort of creeps in. You just don't know what to do. The first thing was to make sure the police knew every single thing possible.
But Susan Haynes' disappearance would not be the only missing person case to hit the area. The Reeve family were amongst the many residents enjoying an idyllic home life in the attractive streets of Bergen County.
My family was 2 girls and 2 boys. 2 girls came first and then the 2 boys. My profession was as an attorney.
The parents' eldest daughter, Susan, was still living at home.
Susan was a delightful girl, very attractive young lady, a likable person. Everybody liked her very much. She was Susan Sunshine.
Having just returned from a month-long vacation trip to Europe, the 22-year-old had landed a new job.
Susan Reeve worked in an advertising agency in New York City. She had just graduated from Hollins College in Virginia, and this was her first job.
She had a lot of friends. She was hardworking and fun-loving.
She has got everything to live for. She's just got it all.
She had just become engaged to be married, and she was looking forward to getting married.
On the 14th of October 1975, 8 days after the disappearance of newlywed Susan Haynes, Susan Reeve set off for work as usual.
She rode a commuter bus to work every day. It was very convenient. The bus stop was just a short walk from her house where she lived with her parents.
At the end of her working day, Susan had arrived back in her neighborhood at around 6 p.m.
Susan Reeve was walking up this sidewalk after she got off the bus on that far corner and was walking in the direction of her home, which is further up Anderson Avenue. And then all of a sudden, she was nowhere to be found.
As the time went on, we began to wonder and called around to her fiance and other people to see if perhaps she had a date she had neglected to tell us about.
She was not the type of girl who would irresponsibly stop off for a drink someplace without telling her parents about it at the very least.
And they came down later on looking, and she was nowhere to be found. I mean, they came down, where'd she go? Why isn't she home?
So we called the police and reported her missing.
An eyewitness report on the George Washington Bridge gave cause for concern.
One of the toll collectors in the early evening hours saw a car drive up. The man was playing the radio rather loudly. She heard something coming from, she thought, the back of the car. A female voice, distinctly crying out, "Help me, he's crazy. Help me, he's crazy." screaming over and over again. The man sped off across the bridge and disappeared from her sight.
We all were being driven crazy with apprehension and not knowing what happened almost every day, looking somewhere. Some clue would come about and I would search an area, but to no avail.
The disappearance of Susan Haynes just over a week earlier also rang alarm bells.
2 women unexplainedly not showing up where they're supposed to be. Police now have to see that there's a strong possibility there could be criminality involved.
Police very quickly told me there's another young woman who had gone missing, and they very quickly put 2 and 2 together. I don't think there was any hesitation. They thought the coincidence was too great to ignore.
I think we thought she might have been kidnapped, and we hoped that we would receive a request for ransom.
2 young women called Susan had now disappeared from the comfortable suburbs of Bergen County. A week later, in Manhattan, a clerk at Macy's department store was approached by a man selling jewelry. One item in particular caught his attention.
The ring was a very unique ring. It was an engagement ring, but this was a different kind of ring. It was made specially.
The ring had belonged to newlywed Susan Haynes and never usually left her finger.
The engagement ring, which we bought from Harrods in England, was fairly unique. Looking at it sideways, it was shaped as an S and had a unique pattern of small diamonds and a central diamond. Not an overly expensive ring, but a particularly nice design, which we chose.
2 days later, the man returned, desperate to buy the ring back, but the store couldn't at first find it.
He had raised such a stink, made such a scene out of not being able to immediately get the ring back.
He's screaming. It's causing all kinds of problems. So bad, they bring store security up to calm him down.
The man eventually was able to buy the ring back for $100 in cash. He would later be identified as charismatic Bergen County resident Robert Reldon. And with his millionaire aunt, Reldon was no stranger to the finer things in life.
Lillian Booth lived in a very, very exclusive small town in northern New Jersey, in Bergen County, a town called Alpine, New Jersey. Many rock stars and rap stars and movie celebrities still live in that area. It's an area with multi-million-dollar homes and tennis courts and swimming pools. And the family was often invited to go there. She would wear flashy jewelry. She was ostentatious about her wealth.
Reldon lived a playboy's life because his wealthy aunt financed horseback riding lessons, skiing trips. She gave him everything that a person could want.
But there was more to Robert Reldon than met the eye.
If you didn't know him, you would think he was the sweetest person in the world, because he would charm you to death.
Robert Reldon was in fact a parolee, and at the time of the disappearance of the 2 Susans, had been free for only 5 months, having been arrested for an attack in 1971. That day, patrolman Charles Moore had been on duty.
I received a radio call stating there was an attempted rape at Metuchen Manor. It's an apartment complex.
A young woman had just been threatened by a stranger.
He jumped in her car and pulled a knife, and she thought it was a robbery. She pushed the purse towards him, and he said, "That's not what I'm after." And she jumped out of the car.
Searching the area, Officer Moore spotted a man matching the description of the attacker, 30-year-old Robert Reldon.
The thing that got me was the eye contact. I immediately knew that this is the guy. As soon as we got near each other, he bolted into an ice cream store. He sort of hit the counter with his hand. I stopped him, told him to freeze. I had my hand on my weapon. And he stopped and said, let's walk outside, because there was so many people, buying ice cream.
While additional officers held Reldon, the patrolman retraced his steps.
I went back into the store to where he hit the counter and retrieved a blue-handled throwing knife.
Reldon claimed he was in the area visiting a friend in hospital, a Mr. Prendergast.
I went to Kennedy Hospital with another officer, and we went up and see if we can interview Mr. Prendergast. We went up and asked him if he knew Reldon, and he said, yes, he did. And I said, well, how do you know him? And he says, well, he was his prize pupil. I said, a teacher or what? And he says, no. He had relayed in some manner. He was the chief psychiatrist in Broadway Prison for Sex Offenders Unit.
It was far from the first time that Robert Reldon had been in trouble, and tragically, it would not be the last. In separate incidents in early October 1975, newlywed Susan Haynes and bride-to-be Susan Reeve had mysteriously disappeared from the comfortable suburbs of Bergen County. Investigators were baffled.
Two women in a relatively close area suddenly disappearing with no explanation, no answer. If you have no evidence and no witnesses, what police activities can you put into effect? You have to have something to start with.
But on the 21st of the month, investigators got a break. The toll booth operator, who had heard a frightened female calling from a car, was shown a photo lineup. She picked the driver out as parolee Robert Reldon.
They didn't have any firm suspicions about him. It was a routine matter. Record of sexual activity, bring him in.
When the charismatic 35-year-old was questioned, everything appeared to be in order.
He was very positive, and he said, here's a diary of what I've been doing in the past 6 months.
But when investigators checked the diary, overly detailed alibis on the days of the disappearances raised suspicions.
Reldon had elaborately pointed out that he had stopped off at a bar not far from his house. He had a bitter lemon, non-alcoholic beverage. So the investigators actually went to that bar. And the bartenders said that they do not stock bitter lemon as a beverage in their bar.
The following day, investigators were called to a park just across the state line.
One of the local residents was walking his dog and trying to take a walk down the pathway to the shore of the reservoir, and the dog kept dragging him to go off to the right.
The dog pulled him toward a more secluded pathway, and there he discovered the body of a human being.
News soon reached the loved ones of the two missing Susans of Bergen County.
He came quietly to me and said, "A body's been found." And I think at that time, we all realized it was most likely to be Susan.
Dental records confirmed the victim was indeed the young British newlywed, Susan Haynes.
I don't think many people in this world can imagine how bad that was. It was horrendous, and something which has stuck with me forever.
An autopsy confirmed that Susan had suffered a brutal attack.
From all indications, she has been the victim of a murder.
The hyoid bone in the neck was broken. The body had been garroted around the neck with a women's hose, a stick tied in it, and tightened.
The horrific strangulation confirmed to police that they were now dealing with a sadistic killer. 35-year-old Robert Reldon became the prime suspect. And the man with the millionaire aunt had a long history of criminal behavior.
He committed his first offense when he was 16. He went across the George Washington Bridge into the Riverside Drive area of New York City, and in one of the apartment buildings there accosted a woman, stole her pocketbook, and ran off.
There's no real gain in purse snatching from a monetary perspective, but there's a lot of psychological gain. When someone like Reldon is doing minor crimes like this to get money when he really doesn't need it, and plus the risk is enormous because you can go to jail for an extended period of time for just a very minor crime. It's not to get money, it's to satisfy himself psychologically. Individuals like this enjoy violating the rights of others. It's stimulating for them. It's arousing for them. And so they do it, and they do it repetitively because it's that stimulating.
Thefts, burglaries and muggings continued through the 60s for the young middle-class man who seemingly had no need for money.
From our perspective, he had it all. We would be envious of him, but he wanted more. There was an entitlement there. First of all, he had had psychiatric exams early in his career as a juvenile. They said he had animosity to women and marked animosity to his mother. And he just thought he was a guy who was entitled to a lot more than he was getting from Aunt Lillian.
Almost from the time he was in high school, his crimes were directed against women.
Most crime escalates. Crime begins early on. It can begin just in fantasy, then it can go into voyeurism or peeping. It can go into break and entry, sexual assault, and then sexual murder. And if you look at the criminal histories of most serial sexual murderers, you have that very similar pattern, particularly burglary, because many burglaries are sexually motivated. It's the break-in itself is sexually stimulating.
Then in 1967, Reldon spotted a local Bergen County housewife.
He's sitting in his brand new Volkswagen, and she drove by, and he became fixated on her. He followed her home. He used his charm, and he got her to allow him to come in to supposedly make a phone call, and he rapes her. And then he gets out and gets his car and drives away.
If you look at normal individuals, in the course of a day, most people come in contact with someone that they have some sort of attraction to. You don't attack the person, you control yourself. And Reldon was certainly capable of controlling himself, but he chose not to control himself.
But Reldon's brazen attack had not gone unnoticed. His Volkswagen Beetle, a present from Aunt Lillian, had been spotted at the scene, and the 26-year-old was convicted. Robert Reldon was sent to a new rehabilitation program for sex offenders at Rahway State Prison.
Reldon would be the poster child for the program because he was so good looking. He said all the right things. He could shine in front of the whole world.
It appeared that the new program suited Reldon.
Reldon was very smart, knew the right terms to throw back at the psychologist to show that the treatment was working.
All you needed was a psychiatrist and maybe an officer to recommend you for the parole board. The psychiatrist would say, "Oh, he's cured. It's a miracle."
In the report, he used the phrase, "If Reldon is released on parole, I predict that Robert Reldon will become the most successful parolee in the history of the criminal justice system."
And released on parole, Reldon was in 1970, when he held the young woman at knife point in her car. The incident led to his return to Rahway Prison, where despite his offences, his charm seemingly continued to win over the staff.
He was entirely different than 99% of the inmates. He knew just what to say. He knew how to play the game. All the psychs couldn't figure him out. In fact, he had them all fooled.
Different people would come, and he could speak well, and he showed just enough humility to win everybody.
He was such a good con man.
Robert Reldon won parole yet again in May 1975. Now, just 5 months later, 2 young women had disappeared from the streets, and one had been found murdered. On the 28th of October, the news got worse.
Another body, a woman, had been discovered in Tallman Mountain State Park.
Former prosecutor Charles Buckley remembers the scene that faced investigators.
Well, the body was found off the park into the environs of the river there. Park employees were checking the pipe to make sure that there was not a high chlorine level, and the body was found lying on its back in the water with the arms sticking up in the air.
It was missing 22-year-old Susan Reeve, and it was clear she hadn't died of natural causes.
But the body's not right. It couldn't have been situated that way with its arms sticking up in the air. The arms would have been down. Clearly, the police knew this body had been placed there.
The shocking news stunned the residents of Bergen County. The press dubbed the murders the Susan Stranglings, and reports soon reached Susan Reeve's father.
I can't even describe it to you. She'd been dead for almost a week, so it would have been very difficult for me to identify her, and it was impossible for her to have a normal funeral. She had to be cremated.
A post-mortem confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted. Her cause of death matched the other Bergen County victim, Susan Haynes.
Both women were killed in exactly the same manner. They were garroted. Their stockings were tied around their neck with a stick in the stocking to twist it.
The most efficient way to kill somebody is with a gun. But a serial sexual murderer wants to get up close and personal. The primary method is strangulation, particularly manual strangulation with your hands, and sometimes ligature strangulation. And they do it so they can control death.
2 days later, prime suspect Robert Reldon was arrested for 2 house burglaries and imprisoned. But Reldon had no intention of staying behind bars, and the rich aunt that had supported him for so long would very soon become his target. In 1975, 2 young women had been abducted from the suburbs of New Jersey's Bergen County, their dead bodies dumped in parkland. And while the prime suspect, Robert Reldon, was in prison for breaking and entering, prosecutors began compiling their case. Meanwhile, Reldon continued to receive the support of his family.
Throughout Robert Reldon's life of crime, his family was always by his side. They never lost faith in him, mother and father, sister, Aunt Lillian.
But it appeared, despite his Aunt Lillian's lifelong support, Reldon was intent on getting his hands on much more of her fortune. He approached two fellow inmates with a proposal.
Can you get someone to kill her? I'm going to need a big-time attorney to represent me. And these guys said, well, all right, we could look into it. And they start working on a plan.
It came through the grapevine, because the grapevine in the prison's a really gigantic thing. And he planned to kill her for her money, because he was in her will.
The inmates reported Reldon's murder plot to authorities. An undercover policeman then posed as a hired hitman.
They met him twice at State's Prison, recorded conversation with him about this desire to kill the aunt. The signal that he wanted to kill her was when he told the investigator that's what he wanted done with the aunt, the slash across the throat. So he was then arrested for that.
Robert Reldon would face a series of trials for the murders of Susan Haynes, Susan Reeve, and conspiracy to murder his aunt. He made an impression on many that encountered him.
Good-looking young man, well-dressed, well-to-do family, polished, charm. Looked like an everyday upper-class gentleman. He had a very commanding presence. He was judged by many to have been the attorney, and his attorney was thought to have been the defendant.
But Robert Reldon was not prepared to rely on the due process of law.
He was being held in a anteroom to the courthouse when somehow he had obtained a can of mace. He took it out, sprayed the guard in the eyes.
My law clerk came running in, locked the two doors, and told me, "Stay where you are." I did not know what was going on.
He had attempted to escape. He jumped out the second-story window and broke both ankles, and he still ran.
I ran down the stairs of the main part of the courthouse, out into the car park, and I was running, trying to find this guy, and I was going to get him.
Despite Jonathan Haynes' best efforts, Reldon managed to reach a car.
Well, he was being chased by police up the highway, got into New York State.
But the fugitive's bid for freedom didn't last.
He was apprehended when the car went off the road, over into a ditch.
In 1986, Robert Reldon was finally sentenced to 30 years for the murder of Susan Haynes and life imprisonment for the murder of Susan Reeve. But the question remains, what was the motive for Reldon's life of crime? Was the privileged young man shaped by his upbringing? Or was he born to kill?
Reldon was, I think, greed was the problem. Reldon felt he should be getting more from his aunt. She never gave him enough to satisfy him. He just felt animosity towards women, and I think that this hatred caused him to reach out and rape.
You know what? So many times, like, you talk to prisoners and they say, well, my environment, I didn't have a father, my mother was a junkie. He had everything. So how can you possibly explain why he did that?
Personally, I think there's just something missing in him. I find it very hard to believe that it was the nurturing aspect. I think there's something psychologically wrong with Reldon. He's missing compassion and humanity.
He probably wasn't born to kill, but by the time he reached 16, he must have had an aggression and hostility against women for whatever reason, and something grew into, frankly, a monster.
When you look at Reldon, if you try to understand him as to a reaction to events that occurred in his life, you're going to miss the entire boat here. There is really no watershed event in Reldon's life that made him do what he eventually wound up doing. This is internal. This is the way he is. From a very early age, he enjoyed violating the rights of others. These individuals function in a very different sphere than the rest of us do. When they see someone with belongings, they think those belongings really belong to them, and it's their job then just to take it from the person. These things are inborn, really, to a great extent. And it's gratifying himself by hurting others, and really hurting others, not just a little bit, by a lot. This is sexually stimulating and part of his sexual arousal pattern.
"21 years after he was sentenced, Robert Reldon's lifelong supporter, Aunt Lillian, passed away. And from her, the inmate inherited the income from a $9 million trust fund. The family of Susan Reeve were determined that her murderer shouldn't receive the money and began legal action. In 2010, the court ruled that Reldon must pay damages to them and that they should receive the income from the trust fund for the rest of Reldon's life.
Barbara and I wanted nothing of Reldon's money. To have taken anything from him might have given him some solace in thinking that we had accepted compensation for what he had done. So we determined the money would go into a memorial scholarship fund in the college from which Susan had just graduated. It's been a very rewarding experience.
And the loved ones of midwife Susan Haynes, whose life was snuffed out just after her marriage, ensure she'll also never be forgotten.
She's buried in our local churchyard where we got married. It's quite difficult to imagine that at this 13th century church where we got married, she's still there. I'm extremely proud of Susan, and I know she'd be well remembered. Friends all around who still remember her. It was very sad. To be confronted with murder, it stays with me for the rest of my life. I'm nearly 70. It's still there.
The phone rang just after dawn, cutting through the thin mountain silence like a blade, and somewhere between the second and third ring, a truth that had been buried for more than 3 decades began to claw its way back to the surface. Because in Colorado, where the Rockies loom like silent witnesses and small towns remember everything, a cold case never really sleeps. It just waits, frozen in time, waiting for one mistake, one overlooked detail, one breath of courage that comes far too late. And the voice on the other end of the line carried that weight, the kind that bends spines and tightens throats, the kind detectives recognize instantly, because this wasn't a tip, it wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a theory recycled from an old case file. This was the sound of a secret cracking open, and as the receiver pressed against skin worn thin by years of unanswered questions, the past surged forward, dragging 1991 with it, dragging the blood, the fear, the silence, the name everyone stopped, saying out loud. Back then, Colorado looked different, not just because the year was stamped with flannel shirts and cassette tapes, but because the illusion of safety still held, because doors were left unlocked in towns where everyone waved, where neighbors borrowed sugar and kids rode bikes until streetlights flickered on, and no one imagined that something so violent, so precise, could erupt without warning, because the morning it happened began like any other: cold air, pale sun, frost clinging to, windshields, and then the sirens came, sharp and frantic, echoing off storefronts and canyon walls, and by the time the first patrol car skidded to stop, the scene was already contaminated by shock, by disbelief, by the creeping realization that this was an accident, this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was something darker. The body lay where it fell, positioned in a way that told a story no one wanted to read. And even before names are confirmed, even before the coroner arrived, the word spread. Because it always does. Because fear moves faster than facts, and by noon, the town was divided into two camps, those who whispered and those who stared straight ahead pretending nothing had changed. But everyone felt it, the shift, the moment when safety cracked and something ugly slipped through. Because this wasn't just a death. It was a rupture, a violation, a question with no answer. Investigators worked the scene with the urgency of men who knew time was already against them, snapping photographs, bagging evidence, marking footprints in dirt already threatened by wind. But even then, even in those first frantic hours, something crucial slipped past unnoticed, not because they were careless, not because they were incompetent, but because sometimes the most important clues are the ones that look ordinary, the ones that blend into the background, waiting patiently while. Careers are built and retired, while families grow old with empty chairs at dinner tables. The victim's name became a headline, then a chant, then a memory people carried like a bruise. And in the days that followed, investigators knocked on every door, pulled apart routines, questioned alibis that sounded solid until they didn't. Because everyone knew everyone, and that made things worse. Because familiarity breeds both trust and deception, and the line between the two blurred until nothing felt reliable anymore. And still, despite the manpower, despite the press, despite the pressure from above to deliver answers fast, the case began to cool slowly, painfully, like embers buried under snow. Months turned into years. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved away or forgot details they once swore they'd never forget. And the case file grew thicker even as progress stalled. Each page another attempt, another theory, another dead end, and detectives rotated out, new ones rotated in, each promising they would be the one to finally break it open, and each leaving behind the same unanswered questions, the same haunting photographs, the same silence that settled heavier with every passing year. The community learned to live around the absence, to step carefully around anniversaries, to avoid certain places after dark, and parents began locking doors, watching their children longer. Because even if the threat was invisible, it felt close, personal, unfinished, and every so often, the case would resurface, sparked by a documentary, a newspaper anniversary piece, a new sheriff campaigning on closure, and hope would flicker again, brief and fragile, before fading back into resignation. But what no one knew, what no one could have known, was that the answer had been there from the beginning, hidden in plain sight, cataloged, archived, dismissed as irrelevant, waiting for a world that didn't exist yet, waiting for technology that hadn't been invented, waiting for someone willing to ask a question no one had thought to ask before. Because cold cases aren't just about the past. They're about timing, about patience, about the long arc of truth bending slowly, relentlessly toward exposure. And now, decades later, with new eyes and new tools, the file was opened again, not ceremonially, not with press releases and promises, but quietly, deliberately, because the detectives who reopened it knew better than to announce anything too soon. They knew that hope is dangerous, especially when it's been denied for so long. And as the first pages returned, as the photographs were re-examined under harsher light, something shifted, something subtle but unmistakable, the sense that this time was different, that this time the silence was about to break. Because buried in the margins of that old investigation, tucked between routine reports and forgotten evidence logs, was a detail no one had ever fully understood, a detail that didn't scream guilt or innocence, a detail that waited patiently while decades passed. And as modern technology finally caught up to human intuition, that detail began to glow, faint at first, then undeniable, like a signal flaring in the dark. And with it came a realization that sent a ripple through the task force. Because if this clue meant what they thought it meant, then the person responsible hadn't vanished, hadn't died, hadn't escaped justice forever. They had been living, breathing, blending in for 35 years. And as the sun rose higher over Colorado that morning, casting long shadows over mountains that had seen everything and said nothing, the investigators knew they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. Because once the past starts talking, it doesn't whisper, it roars. And somewhere unknowingly, a suspect was about to learn that time does not erase guilt. it only sharpens it. And the frozen case that had haunted a community since 1991 was beginning to thaw. The files smelled like dust and time. Paper yellowed at the edges, corners softened by hands that had turned these pages again and again over the years, each touch leaving behind a little more frustration, a little more hope drained away. And as the detectives sat under the cold fluorescent lights of the evidence room, they didn't speak at first, because there are moments when silence carries more weight than any conversation, moments when everyone in the room feels the same thing at the same time, that low hum of intuition, the sense that something is wrong with the story they've all been telling themselves for decades. The photographs stare back from the tabletop, frozen moments from a morning in 1991 that refused to stay buried, and the faces in those photos hadn't changed, but the eyes looking at them now had sharpened by experience, trained by years of cases that taught one brutal lesson over and over again. The truth doesn't hide, it waits. Back then, investigators had followed the obvious paths first, because that's what the pressure demanded. Quick answers, familiar motives, suspects who fit the shape of the crime too neatly to ignore, and they chased those paths hard, questioning acquaintances, scrutinizing lovers, probing grudges that simmered just below the surface of small-town politeness. But every trail collapsed under scrutiny. Alibis held just enough to survive. Evidence refused to align, and slowly the case slipped from urgency into routine, from routine into neglect, until it became something spoken about in hushed tones, a cautionary tale rather than an active pursuit of justice. What the original team couldn't see, what no one was equipped to see in 1991, was how much noise surrounded the truth, how distraction can be just as effective as deception, and how a single, seemingly meaningless detail can drown in a sea of louder facts. It was there in the logs, a brief note scribbled by a patrol officer who never imagined his handwriting would matter decades later, a notation about an object found near the scene. Not unusual, not incriminating, not worth further attention at the time, cataloged and boxed away with dozens of other items that fill the evidence locker like a museum of unfinished stories. As the modern task force combed through that inventory, rescanning, relabeling, recontextualizing everything with tools the original investigators could never have dreamed of, that object surfaced again, flagged not by instinct, but by algorithm, by a system designed to notice patterns humans overlook, and when the result appeared on the screen, it didn't explode with drama. It didn't announce itself with certainty. It simply raised a question, a quiet, unsettling question that lingered in the room long after the computer finished processing. Because the question wasn't who did this. Not yet. The question was how. How someone could have been so close to the center of this case, so present, so visible, and still remain unseen. And once that question took hold, it changed everything, because it forced the investigators to reconsider every assumption that had guided the original inquiry, every conclusion that had been accepted, because there was nothing better to replace it. They went back to the timeline, stripped it down to bare bones, minute by minute, hour by hour, reconstructing the victim's last known movements with ruthless precision. And in doing so, they noticed something that had always been there, hiding in plain sight, a gap small enough to dismiss, large enough to conceal the truth, a window of time that didn't fit neatly into any narrative that had been offered before. And when they widened that window, when they stopped forcing it to close, new possibilities flooded in. Witness statements were pulled from the archive, voices from the past speaking again through transcripts and recordings that crackle with age, and one by one, those voices were re-examined, not for what they said, but for what they didn't, for the hesitations, the contradictions so minor they'd once been overlooked, the moments where certainty slipped just enough to raise suspicion, and as patterns began to emerge, the investigators felt that familiar tightening in the chest, the sensation that comes when a case shifts from cold to dangerous, because the closer you get to truth, the more resistance you encounter, even decades later. Names resurfaced, not as suspects, not yet, but as points of interest, people who had orbited the case without ever being pulled into its gravity, people who had provided information freely, cooperated fully, then moved on with their lives while the town remained frozen in the aftermath. And among those names, one appeared again and again, not prominently, not dramatically, but consistently, a background figure who seemed to exist on the periphery of every key moment, close enough to be helpful, distant enough to be forgotten. At first, it felt like coincidence. The The kind of coincidence that thrives in small communities where paths cross naturally, but coincidence loses its innocence when examined under pressure, and as the investigators mapped out interactions, locations, overlaps, that innocence began to erode, replaced by something colder, something deliberate, and the realization settled slowly, heavily, that this person had known more than they admitted, had seen more than they revealed, and had shaped the investigation in subtle ways no one had questioned at the time. Technology did what memory could not, layering data over decades-old testimony, cross-referencing records that had once lived in separate worlds, and when the results converged, when disparate strands snapped into alignment, the room went quiet again, because this wasn't speculation anymore. This was structure. This was motive taking shape. This was opportunity crystallizing out of chaos. And with every confirmation, the weight of 35 years pressed down harder, because every year that passed without answers now felt like a failure that demanded reckoning. They knew better than to rush, better than to announce a breakthrough before it could withstand the kind of scrutiny that destroys fragile cases. So they moved carefully and methodically, building a foundation that could support the truth when it finally emerged into the light. And as they did, they discovered something else, something that sent a chill through even the most seasoned investigators, because the suspect they were circling hadn't just slipped through the cracks. They had navigated them, exploiting blind spots that only someone with intimate knowledge of the system could recognize. That realization reframed everything, casting old decisions in a new, harsher light, and forced the team to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that the case hadn't gone cold by accident, that its stagnation may have been guided, nudged, steered just enough to ensure nothing ever quite reached the threshold of proof. And once that door opened, it refused to close. The community, unaware of the storm gathering beneath the surface, continued its routines, unaware that the past was being rewritten in quiet rooms filled with files and screens, unaware that the story they thought they knew was about to fracture, and that the person they waved to, trusted, defended, might be standing at the center of a lie so carefully constructed it had survived for more than 3 decades. And as the investigators prepared to take the next step, to move from analysis to action, from theory to confrontation, they understood the stakes, because this wasn't just about solving crime. It was about restoring faith, about proving that time does not grant immunity, that progress does not erase responsibility, and that even the coldest cases can still burn when exposed to the right spark. Somewhere, the hidden clue that had waited so patiently was finally doing its work, unraveling a life built on silence, pulling threads that led inexorably to a reckoning long overdue. And as the evidence stack grew taller, as certainty replaced doubt, one truth became impossible to ignore. The arrest that would come would not just shock the suspect, it would stun an entire community, because the monster they'd feared for years wasn't an outsider, wasn't a shadow lurking beyond town limits. It was someone who had been there all along, hiding in the open, waiting for everyone to stop looking. And now, after 35 years, they were looking again. The closer they moved toward the truth, the more the past began to resist, as if the case itself had learned how to defend the secret it had protected for so long. And every new discovery seemed to drag something darker into the light, something that had been waiting beneath the surface of normal life, patiently, silently, counting on time to dull suspicion and scatter memory. In the interview room, screens glowed with timelines rebuilt from fragments, and voices from 1991 echoed through modern speakers, their words suddenly sharper, more revealing than they had ever been when first spoken, because context changes everything, and what once sounded harmless now carried the weight of evasion. The investigators focus on patterns, not events, because events can be staged, but patterns reveal behavior, and behavior, repeated often enough, becomes truth. They trace movements through receipts, handwritten logs, landline call records that have been preserved on fading paper. Each detail a thread pulled from the fabric of life that had never expected to be examined as closely again. The suspect's routine emerged slowly, a map of habits that intersected with the victim's world more frequently than coincidence could explain, moment of overlap that had gone unnoticed because no one had ever lined them up side by side before. There were days when progress felt invisible, when hours of work produced nothing more than a single question mark. But then there were moments like this, moments when a line drawn across a map suddenly intersected another, when 2 unrelated facts snapped together with an audible click, and the room filled with that unmistakable energy, the sense that something irreversible had just happened, a location visited too often, A time window too perfectly aligned. A reason to be present that sounded reasonable until it was examined twice. They revisited the original interviews, not to accuse, not yet, but to listen again with different ears. And in those recordings, the suspect's voice carried a calm confidence that stood out now, an ease that bordered on rehearsed, answers delivered without hesitation, details volunteered before questions were fully formed, a performance so smooth it had disarmed the investigators who first sat across the table, men and women trained to spot lies, but operating without the benefit of distance, without the cold clarity that only years can provide. Back then, cooperation had been mistaken for innocence, familiarity mistaken for trustworthiness, and the suspect had understood that instinctively, leaning into it, shaping their narrative around what investigators expected to hear, not what they needed to know. Every statement had been technically accurate, just incomplete enough to conceal the truth, and as the modern team dissected those answers line by line, they began to see the gaps, the places where the story bent without breaking, where precision gave way to vagueness at exactly the wrong moments. The hidden clue that had reignited the case sat quietly at the center of this reevaluation, its significance growing with every new connection, and when forensic analysts applied contemporary techniques to evidence that had once been considered exhausted, the results were subtle but devastating, not a single smoking gun, but a convergence of indicators that all pointed in the same direction. It was no longer a question of if the suspect had been involved, but how much and how deeply. As the picture sharpened, the emotional toll became harder to ignore, especially for those who had lived in the community their entire lives, who remembered the fear that had followed the crime, the locked doors, the whispered warnings, the way parents had watched their children more closely, and now, the realization that the threat may never have left at all, that it had simply blended in, taken on a familiar face, attended the same gatherings, shared the same spaces. The investigators knew they were approaching a line that, once crossed, would change everything, and they prepared carefully, because confronting a suspect after 35 years is not just an investigative step. It's an intrusion into a life that has been built on the assumption of safety, on the belief that whatever happened in 1991 had been buried by time and entropy. They reviewed strategy, debated timing, considered the psychological impact of a sudden confrontation versus a gradual tightening of pressure, because at this stage, mistakes could still unravel months of work. Behind closed doors, legal teams examined the growing body of evidence, testing it against the standards of modern prosecution, asking hard questions about admissibility, about degradation, about whether memory could be trusted when resurrected after decades, and the answer again and again was cautious optimism, because while time complicates justice, it does not erase it, and the strength of this case lay not in any single piece of evidence, but in the way each piece reinforced the others, forming a structure too solid to ignore. They reached out to witnesses who had long since moved on, people who had assumed their brief involvement with the case was over forever, and the calls were met with surprise, hesitation, sometimes fear, but also relief, because many had carried unanswered questions of their own, doubts they had never voiced, instincts they had suppressed because no one had asked them to trust those instincts before. And when they spoke now with distant softening old loyalties, their recollections added texture to the narrative, confirming suspicions the investigators had only just begun to articulate. One witness remembered a conversation that had always felt wrong in retrospect, a comment made casually that revealed knowledge no one should have had at that stage of the investigation. Another recalled a moment of visible agitation, when certain details were mentioned, reactions that hadn't meant much at the time, but now fit too neatly into the emerging pattern. Each memory was fragile, imperfect, but together they formed a chorus that echoed the same uncomfortable truth. The suspect, unaware of how close the walls were closing in, continued life as usual, routines unchanged, confidence intact, and that normalcy was perhaps the most unsettling part of all, because it underscored how completely the past had been compartmentalized, how effectively the crime had been sealed away from daily existence. For the investigators, this was no longer just a case. It was a study in human capacity for concealment, for living two truths at once without visible strain. As preparations for a formal interview took shape, the team understood the psychological battlefield they were about to enter, because confronting someone with a past they believe is untouchable requires precision, restraint, and patience. They would not accuse outright. They would not reveal the full scope of what they knew. Instead, they would listen, watch, allow the suspect to speak freely. Because after decades of silence, the most dangerous thing a person can be given is the opportunity to talk. Every detail of that impending conversation was planned, from the order of questions to the placement of evidence on the table, because this was not just about extracting information. It was about observing reactions, about measuring stress, about identifying a moment when composure fractures, even slightly. The investigators knew that truth has a physical presence, that it changes posture, breathing, tone, and after 35 years, maintaining a lie requires constant vigilance. Outside the station, the town moved through another ordinary day, unaware that history was about to resurface, unaware that the narrative it had accepted for decades was on the verge of collapse, and inside, the case that had once been labeled unsolvable was alive again, pulsing with momentum, driven forward by a hidden clue that had finally found its voice. The question was no longer whether justice would come, but how loud it would be when it arrived. And as the interview room was prepared, as files were stacked and cameras tested, one certainty settled over everyone involved. The past was about to confront the present, and neither would emerge unchanged. The room was quiet in the way only interrogation rooms can be quiet, a silence engineered to amplify every movement, every breath, every hesitation. And when the suspect finally sat down across the table, time seemed to compress, decades folding in on themselves as the past and present occupied the same narrow space. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting a flat, unforgiving glow that stripped away warmth and comfort, leaving only faces and facts and the weight of what had been left unsaid for 35 years. The investigators began gently, as planned, with questions that sounded almost casual, references to routine, to memories of the early 90s, to places and people that had long since faded from everyday conversation. The suspect responded easily at first, posture relaxed, voice steady, a practiced familiarity with the rhythm of questioning that suggested experience, or at least preparation. There was no visible fear, no immediate defensiveness, just the calm assurance of someone who believed the story had already been told and accepted long ago. But calm can be deceptive, and beneath the surface, the investigators watched for the smallest deviations, the slight pauses before answering, the subtle shifts in eye contact, the moments when confidence gave way to calculation. They weren't listening for lies so much as they were listening for effort, because truth, even when painful, tends to flow, while deception requires construction, and construction leaves fingerprints. As the conversation drifted deeper into the timeline of 1991, names were introduced deliberately, one at a time, each chosen for its potential to disrupt the narrative without revealing too much. When a victim's name was spoken, there was a flicker, barely perceptible, a tightening around the eyes that vanished almost instantly, but not before it was noticed. The suspect continued speaking, voice unchanged, but the rhythm faltered just enough to suggest something had shifted. The investigators pressed on, asking about routines, about movements on specific days, about reasons for being in certain places at certain times. And here, the answers grew more precise than necessary, details spilling out in a way that seemed helpful on the surface, but raised questions underneath. Precision can be a shield, a way to control the story by overwhelming it with specifics, and the team allowed it, letting the suspect talk, letting the narrative stretch, knowing that the longer it ran, the more likely it was to tangle itself. Then came the hidden clue, introduced not as an accusation, but as a curiosity, an innocuous reference to an object, a location, a detail that had once been overlooked and now sat at the center of the case. The suspect's response was immediate, too immediate, a denial delivered before the question had fully landed, and in that moment, the room changed. The temperature seemed to drop, the air thickening with tension, as everyone present recognized the significance of that reaction. The investigators didn't challenge it. They didn't correct it. They simply noted it and moved on, because sometimes the most powerful pressure comes not from confrontation, but from restraint. They shifted topics, returned earlier ground, circled back to timelines already discussed, and with each pass, the suspect's composure eroded slightly, small cracks forming in the polished surface of certainty. Outside the room, analysts watched from behind the glass, annotating every movement, every inflection, comparing live behavior to archival footage from decades earlier. Patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore, the same defensive gestures, the same verbal tics, the same moments of over-explanation when a certain subject arose. Time had aged the face, softened the voice, but behavior, it seemed, was remarkably consistent. The interview stretched on, hours passing in a blur of questions and answers, and as fatigue set in, the suspect's guard weakened, just enough to allow glimpses of something else beneath the practiced exterior, frustration, perhaps, or resentment, or the strain of maintaining a version of events that no longer felt secure. When confronted with minor inconsistencies, the explanations grew sharper, edges creeping into a tone that had been smooth at the start. At one point, a photograph was placed on the table, an image pulled from the original case file, grainy and familiar, yet now infused with new meaning. The suspect stared at it for a moment too long, eyes scanning details that hadn't been mentioned, absorbing information that wasn't being offered. And when they finally spoke, the words revealed knowledge that had never been publicly released. It was subtle, a single phrase, a reference to something only the perpetrator or investigators could have known, and the room froze. The investigators exchanged glances, not triumphant, not surprised, but resolute, because this was the moment they had been building toward, the point where suspicion crossed into certainty. They didn't interrupt. They let the suspect continue, because once that boundary is crossed, the story begins to unravel on its own, threads loosening, contradictions multiplying, the weight of decades pressing down on every sentence. By the time the interview ended, the suspect was no longer relaxed, posture rigid, hands clasped tightly together, eyes avoiding the gaze of those across the table. Nothing resembling a confession had been offered, but it wasn't necessary, because what mattered now was the accumulation, the way each reaction, each word, each slip fit into the larger framework of evidence that had been quietly assembled. As the suspect was escorted out, the investigators remained behind, the room still vibrating with the energy of what had just occurred. They reviewed notes, replayed key moments, confirmed what they already knew in their bones. The case had turned a corner. What had once been a cold file, dormant and gathering dust, was now active, alive, accelerating toward a conclusion that will reverberate far beyond these walls. The next steps would be decisive. Warrants would be drafted. Evidence would be re-examined with renewed urgency. The legal machinery that had been waiting patiently in the background would begin to move, and somewhere between past and present, the truth that had been buried for so long was finally beginning to surface, unstoppable now, and ready to claim its place in the light. Night fell hard over Colorado, the kind of night that presses down on a city and makes every streetlight feel like an island. And inside the task force offices, the hours blurred into one continuous stretch of motion. Coffee cups refilled without comment, jackets pulled on and off as adrenaline rose and fell, because everyone in the room understood the same unspoken truth. The case was no longer theoretical. It was moving, and once a cold case starts moving again, it does not slow down politely. It accelerates, dragging the past with it, forcing decisions that can no longer be postponed. The interview replayed on multiple screens, frozen frames marked with timestamps, voices dissected word by word. Investigators leaned in, rewound, paused, listening again to the moment where the suspect knew too much, the inflection that betrayed familiarity with details never released. This was a hinge. This was where 35 years of uncertainty pivoted into direction, not closure. Direction. Files were reopened that night, boxes hauled out that still smelled faintly of cardboard and dust, evidence logs written in the careful handwriting of officers long retired or dead. Every item was treated like a live wire now. What had once been dismissed as inconclusive was suddenly recontextualized, re-examined under modern eyes trained by decades of advancement. The hidden clue that had cracked the case open was no longer alone. It was drawing others toward it, connecting fragments that had been waiting quietly for permission to matter. Forensic specialists arrived before sunrise, laptops replacing clipboards, digital scanners replacing magnifying glasses. Old fibers were reanalyzed. Partial prints were enhanced. Degraded samples were coaxed back into relevance with technology that did not exist when the victim was still alive. The lab hummed with activity, machines running calculations that would have seemed like science fiction in 1991, algorithms reconstructing possibilities, narrowing margins, turning ambiguity into probability. At the same time, detectives went back into the field, not chasing rumors this time, but verifying history. Doors were knocked on that hadn't been touched in decades. Names were spoken that made people pause, squint, reach back into memory. Some reacted with shock, some with relief, some with visible fear. Time had changed faces, but places still remembered. A bar that once hosted late-night conversations. A parking lot where someone waited longer than they should have. A stretch of road where headlights lingered in recollection. Witnesses who had once been unsure now sounded different. Age has a way of dulling fear while sharpening regret. People spoke more freely, unburdened by the consequences they once imagined. Small details emerged, offhand remarks, arguments remembered, a look that seemed wrong even then. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together, it began to form a shape, a silhouette of truth growing darker, more defined. The suspect, meanwhile, returned to a life that suddenly felt exposed. Routine became fragile. Every sound carried significance. Every unknown number felt loaded. Surveillance was discreet but constant, a quiet confirmation that the world had shifted. For years, the past had been safely sealed behind time and assumption. Now it breathed again, close enough to feel. Legal teams were brought in early, strategy meetings held behind closed doors. The standard was clear. Suspicion was not enough. Pattern was not enough. Memory was not enough. This case would stand or fall on evidence, and the evidence had to be unassailable. 35 years had already been lost. No one intended to lose the ending. The victim's family was informed carefully, deliberately, their reactions unfolding in stages. Disbelief first, then guarded hope, then a cautious trembling that came with realizing this might actually be real. They had lived with false starts before. They had learned to protect themselves from optimism. This time felt different, but difference can be dangerous when it has disappointed you before. They asked questions that investigators answered honestly, without promises. Progress was explained, procedures outlined, timeline softened. What mattered most was respect. The case no longer belonged solely to law enforcement. It belonged to those who had waited longest. As evidence mounted, pressure increased. Media inquiries multiplied, rumors spreading faster than facts. Officials kept statements minimal, aware that attention could contaminate witness testimony or alert the suspect prematurely. Silence became a tool again, but now it was intentional, controlled, purposeful. One piece of evidence emerged late in the process, overlooked for decades because it had never fit neatly into the original theory. A record, a transaction, something mundane enough to escape notice in 1991, but glaring under modern scrutiny. When cross-referenced with newly digitized archives, it placed the suspect somewhere they had always denied being, at a time that suddenly mattered more than anything else. Investigators didn't celebrate. They sat with it. They tested it. They tried to break it. Because confirmation bias is the enemy of justice, and they had learned that lesson the hard way over the years. Every new connection was challenged internally before it was trusted. Every assumption was interrogated. As the case tightened, the suspect sensed it. Behavior changed. Movements became erratic. Alibis shifted subtly. A lawyer was contacted. Silence replaced cooperation. To investigators, this was not a setback. It was a signal. A door closing could be just as informative as one opening. Behind the scenes, arrest warrants were drafted and redrafted, language sharpened to withstand scrutiny. Prosecutors walked the narrative again and again, ensuring that every claim was anchored, every leap bridged by fact. They knew defense teams would attack the age of the case, the reliability of memory, the integrity of evidence. Preparation became obsession. And through it all, the hidden clue remained at the center, the small overlooked detail that had refused to disappear, that had waited patiently for the right moment to be seen. It was a reminder that cases do not always break because of dramatic revelations. Sometimes they break because something ordinary finally gets the attention it deserves. The night before the warrant was signed, one investigator stayed late, alone in the office, listening again to the old tapes, looking again at the faded photographs. Not out of necessity, but out of ritual. A private acknowledgement of the path taken, of the years lost, of the weight now resting on what came next. Because once an arrest is made, the story changes forever. Mystery becomes accusation. Silence becomes defense. And the truth, once pursued quietly, must now survive the noise. Outside, Dawn approached again, pale and indifferent, unaware that a line was about to be crossed, that a case frozen in time was seconds away from re-entering history not as an unsolved question, but as a reckoning long delayed and finally unavoidable. The arrest did not come with sirens or shouting or a sudden explosion of chaos, because real reckonings rarely announce themselves that way. It arrived quietly, wrapped in procedure and restraint, a knock on the door delivered with measured force, badges revealed under the flat morning light, voices calm but immovable. The suspect opened the door already knowing, eyes scanning faces for confirmation of what instinct had been warning for days. 35 years collapsed into a single breath as hands were guided behind a back that had long believed it was free. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, curiosity mixing with confusion, unaware that history was unfolding on their street, that the man being escorted to an unmarked vehicle was no longer just a familiar presence, but a living link to a crime that had haunted an entire community since 1991. No one shouted. No one resisted. The door closed softly and the vehicle pulled away, carrying with it decades of denial and a future suddenly stripped of certainty. Inside the station, the tone shifted again. Formalities were observed, rights read aloud, fingerprints taken not as speculation, but as confirmation. The suspect sat alone in a holding room, walls bare, time elastic, every second stretching under the weight of what was now unavoidable. This was no longer an interview. This was consequence. Investigators reviewed the arrest packet one final time. Each page a distillation of thousands of hours of work. Each line justified, defensible, precise. They knew what this moment represented, not just professionally, but morally. Arresting someone after 35 years is not an act of triumph. It is an act of responsibility. The margin for error is razor thin, and the cost of being wrong is irreversible. The interrogation resumed later that day, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The casual tone was gone. The patience remained, but it was now edged with gravity. Questions were direct. Timelines were fixed. Contradictions were no longer curiosities, but pressure points. The suspect responded differently now, guarded, clipped, choosing silence more often than speech. When words did come, they were measured, defensive, stripped of the earlier confidence. Evidence was presented slowly, deliberately, not as a barrage but as a sequence, each piece building on the last, tightening the narrative. The hidden clue returned, this time contextualized, no longer abstract, but anchored corroboration, to records, to data that could not be argued away. The suspect watched, listened, said nothing, but the strain was visible, a tension in the jaw, a tremor in the hands, the body betraying what the voice refused to offer. Outside the room, prosecutors observed, already thinking ahead to trial. To juries who would need to understand why justice had taken so long, why memory could still matter, why evidence aged but did not expire. They discussed strategy in low voices, anticipating defense arguments before they were made, rehearsing responses grounded not in emotion but in logic. This case would not be one on outrage. It would be one on clarity. News of the arrest spread quickly, restrained statements giving way to speculation, headlines cautiously worded but impossible to ignore. The community reacted in waves. Shock first, then disbelief, then a slow, collective reckoning as people realized that the unanswered questions they had lived alongside for decades were finally being addressed. Some felt relief, others felt anger. Many felt both at once. The victim's family received the call they had waited for, though none of them had truly believed it would ever come. There was no celebration, no sense of victory. There were tears, long and quiet, and a silence that followed, heavy with the realization that resolution does not restore what was taken. It only acknowledges it. They asked again if it was real. They asked what came next. They asked how sure everyone was. Investigators answered honestly, outlining the process ahead, the legal road still to be traveled. An arrest is not a verdict. It is an opening statement. The family understood this, even as hope crept back in, fragile and cautious. As days passed, the suspect was transferred, arraigned, the formal machinery of justice clicking into place. Courtrooms filled with observers, reporters scribbling notes, cameras flashing as the accused appeared, expression unreadable, history pressing down from every angle. Charges were read aloud, words echoing in the chamber, transforming rumor into record. The defense moved quickly, filing motions, challenging timelines, questioning the reliability of evidence so old it predated smartphones, digital records, even widespread DNA databases. They argued contamination. They argued memory decay. They argued coincidence. It was expected. It was necessary. This was how the system tested itself. Investigators welcomed the scrutiny. They had built the case knowing it would be attacked from every side. Every piece of evidence had been verified and re-verified. Every witness statement corroborated where possible. Every assumption challenged internally before it ever reached a courtroom. The past had been given one final chance to speak, and it had done so clearly. Behind closed doors, the suspect's resolve began to waver. Isolation has a way of amplifying thought, of forcing reflection when distraction is removed. The weight of evidence, the inevitability of proceedings, the knowledge that silence could no longer erase the past began to press in. Conversations with counsel grew longer, more urgent. Options narrowed. And somewhere in that narrowing space, between what had been done and what could no longer be undone, the truth hovered, heavy and unresolved, waiting for the moment when it would either be spoken aloud or proven beyond denial, because the case was no longer about whether the past mattered. It was about whether it would finally be acknowledged, in full view of a world that had moved on without answers for far too long. The courtroom air felt different now. Thicker, charged with the kind of restrained electricity that only comes when a story buried for decades is forced into the open. With benches creaked under shifting bodies, journalists leaned forward with pens poised, and the judge's entrance snapped the room into rigid attention. This was no longer an investigation unfolding in quiet offices and late-night labs. This was public reckoning. Every word spoken here would echo far beyond these walls. Prosecutors began methodically, not with emotion, but with time. They walked the jury backward, year by year, peeling away the layers that had allowed the crime to sleep undisturbed. They explained how evidence once thought insignificant had been reinterpreted, how technology had bridged gaps memory could not, how a single overlooked detail had acted like a thread, and when pulled, unraveled the entire fabric of the suspect's story. The narrative was calm, precise, relentless. The defense listened intently, faces carefully neutral, waiting for openings. They objected when necessary, questioned relevance, pushed back against the idea that modern tools could reliably interpret ancient evidence. They reminded the jury, subtly but persistently, that time erodes certainty, that memory reshapes itself, that coincidence can masquerade as connection. It was a familiar strategy, and it landed where it was meant to, in the space between doubt and belief. Witnesses took the stand one by one, voices trembling at first, then steadier as they spoke. Some had not revisited these memories in years, others never publicly. They described fragments of nights long past, the feel of unease they couldn't explain at the time, the small moments that had seemed unimportant until hindsight transformed them into warnings. Each testimony added weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was human, imperfect, and painfully sincere. When forensic experts testified, the room leaned forward again. Screens displayed comparisons, timelines, reconstructions built from data invisible to the naked eye. They explained processes in plain language, careful not to overwhelm, careful not to overstate. Probability was emphasized, margin of error acknowledged. Science, they reminded everyone, does not claim certainty lightly. That restraint made their conclusions heavier, harder to dismiss. The hidden clue resurfaced here, not as a mystery, but as a bridge. The prosecution laid out how it had been missed, why it hadn't fit the original theory, how its significance only became clear when viewed through a different lens. It was not framed as failure, but as evolution. Investigation, they argued, is not static. It grows as understanding grows. The suspect sat quietly throughout, expression guarded, eyes occasionally drifting toward the jury, then back to the table. There was no visible outburst, no dramatic reaction. Silence became its own statement, interpreted differently by every observer in the room. Some saw guilt, others saw fear. The truth, whatever it was, remained locked behind composure. As proceedings stretched into days, the emotional toll became evident. Jurors carried the weight home with them, instructed not to discuss, not to research, not to speculate, but unable to completely shut out the images and timelines replaying in their minds. The community watched closely, divided between those convinced justice was finally arriving and those uneasy about the power of hindsight. Outside the courthouse, conversations grew sharper. Old arguments resurfaced. Some questioned how no one had seen this sooner. Others defended the past investigators, reminding everyone what tools they hadn't had, what pressures they'd faced. The case reopened old wounds not just for the family, but for the town itself, forcing a collective look inward. Behind the scenes, negotiations began quietly. The evidence was strong, but trials are unpredictable, and everyone knew it. Prosecutors weighed risk against responsibility. Defense attorneys weighed strategy against inevitability. The possibility of confession, long dismissed as unlikely, entered the conversation not as a hope, but as a calculation. And through it all, the victim's absence remained the most powerful presence in the room, a reminder that beneath arguments and objections and legal language was a life interrupted, a future erased, and a truth that had waited 35 years for this moment, for this fragile chance to finally be heard without distortion or delay. By the time the 8th day arrived, fatigue had settled into the courtroom like dust, fine but unavoidable, coating every gesture, every pause, every breath before a sentence was finished. The case no longer felt distant or historical. It felt present, urgent, alive. The past was no longer something being examined. It was something pressing forward, demanding resolution. The prosecution shifted its focus subtly, tightening the lens. They no longer needed to prove that a crime had occurred. That was uncontested. What mattered now was intent, proximity, opportunity. They reconstructed the final hours again, not with new facts, but with sharper alignment, syncing witness accounts with physical evidence, aligning movements with timestamps, showing how chance encounters became deliberate choices. The story grew narrower, more focused, more difficult to escape. Phone records appeared on the screens, grainy at first, then clarified, towers lighting up in sequence, showing paths taken, routes repeated, patterns too consistent to dismiss as random. The technology was modern, but the data was old, resurrected from archives once thought too incomplete to matter. The jury watched as maps filled with lines, as silence filled the room. No one needed to explain what they were seeing. The implication spoke for itself. The defense countered carefully, attacking interpretation rather than fact. They questioned assumptions. They suggested alternative routes, alternate explanations, raised the specter of coincidence again and again, but repetition dulled its edge. Coincidence works best in isolation. Here, everything connected. That was the problem. Then came the witness no one had expected to hear from, not because they were unknown, but because they had always refused. For decades, they had lived quietly, avoiding attention, declining interviews, ignoring calls from investigators and journalists alike. Now, older, slower, but resolute, they took the stand. The room shifted. Even the judge leaned forward. The witness spoke plainly. No embellishment, no drama, just recollection. A car scene at the wrong time. A look exchanged that lingered too long. A feeling that something wasn't right. Dismissed back then as paranoia. They admitted their uncertainty, their fear of being wrong, their regret for staying silent. The honesty disarmed the room. This was not a witness trying to convince. This was someone unburdening themselves. The defense tried to shake them, probing memory, questioning motive, suggesting influence by media coverage. The witness did not waver. They did not claim certainty. They claimed responsibility. That distinction mattered. During a recess, the suspect sat alone, head bowed slightly, hands clasped together. The wall seemed closer now, the options fewer. The legal calculus was changing. Every additional thread pulled tightened the knot. Conversations with counsel grew more intense, whispers punctuated by long silences. The possibility that had hovered at the edges now moved to the center. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution rested for the first time. It was not dramatic. No announcement, just a quiet statement and a seat taken. The weight of it landed slowly. The defense rose almost immediately, requesting time, citing the need to reassess. The judge granted it, and the day ended not with resolution, but with anticipation so sharp it bordered on discomfort. That night, the community waited. News stations looped the same footage. Analysts speculated. Social media reignited with arguments and theories. But beneath the noise was a shared understanding. Something was about to shift. The case had reached a point of no return. Whether through verdict or admission, the truth was closing in. And somewhere, in a holding cell lit by fluorescent light that never fully dimmed, a man confronted the past he had outrun for 35 years, realizing that silence, once a shield, had become a cage, and that the story he had buried was no longer willing to stay buried. Morning broke without relief. The sky outside the courthouse was flat and colorless, the kind of gray that felt permanent, as if the day itself had been stripped of options. Inside, tension replaced fatigue. Everyone sensed it. This was the stretch where stories either collapsed or crystallized into something irreversible. The defense opened slowly, deliberately, as if buying time with every measured step toward the podium. Their tone shifted from skepticism to sympathy. They spoke about uncertainty, about the danger of forcing meaning onto fragments, about how decades of speculation can harden into belief without ever becoming truth. They reminded the jury that absence of explanation is not proof of guilt, that justice demands restraint as much as resolve. They called their first witness, an expert in memory degradation. Charts appeared. Studies were cited. The science of forgetting was laid bare. How recollection bends under repetition. How confidence can grow even as accuracy fades. It was effective. Heads nodded. Pens scribbled. Doubt, carefully cultivated, seeped back into the room. But doubt has limits. The prosecution rose again, not to argue but to clarify. They acknowledged memory's flaws openly, then redirected attention to what did not rely on memory at all. Physical evidence, digital traces, the hidden clue that had survived untouched by human recollection. They framed it as an anchor, something solid in a sea of uncertainty. The contrast was stark. Then came the moment no one had predicted on the schedule. During a routine sidebar, voices low, faces tense, the defense requested a brief recess. The judge agreed. The jury was ushered out. The room emptied except for attorneys, the defendant, and the quiet hum of lights overhead. Minutes stretched. Conversations happened in hushed fragments. Words clipped, urgent. When the jury returned, the atmosphere had changed completely. The defense attorney stood, cleared their throat, and spoke a sentence that cracked through the room like glass breaking in silence. Their client wished to address the court. A murmur rippled instantly, contained but electric. The judge paused, confirmed the request, issued warnings. Rights were explained, consequences outlined. The defendant listened, nodded once, and stood. He did not look at the jury at first. He stared at the floor, as if grounding himself, as if afraid that eye contact might shatter what little resolve remained. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, uneven, unfamiliar to those who had watched him in silence for days. He began with denial, reflexive, almost rehearsed. Then the cracks appeared, small inconsistencies, corrections, long pauses where words refused to come. The room held its breath. And then, slowly, painfully, the story shifted. He spoke of that night, not in sweeping confession, but in fragments, of being there when he said he wasn't, of seeing what he claimed he never saw, of fear that spiraled out of control. He avoided details at first, skirting edges, minimizing intent, but the facts pressing on him, cornering every attempt to retreat. The prosecution did not interrupt. They let the silence do its work. When the hidden clue was mentioned, his composure finally broke. He hesitated, corrected himself again, then stopped speaking altogether. The pause stretched. Seconds passed. Somewhere in the room, someone exhaled sharply. Then came the admission, not complete, not clean, but undeniable. He had been involved. The courtroom did not erupt. It froze. This was not the kind of confession shaped for headlines. It was raw, reluctant, incomplete, but it was real, enough to redraw everything that had come before. The judge intervened. Proceedings halted, statements curtailed. The jury was dismissed once more, faces stunned, minds racing. Outside, words spread instantly. Phones buzzed. Reporters ran. The community felt the ground shift beneath it, because after 35 years of questions, the unthinkable had finally happened. The silence had broken. When proceedings resumed, the room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. What had been a trial now hovered on the edge of transformation. The narrative no longer belonged solely to investigators or attorneys. It had shifted, unevenly, into the hands of the person who had avoided its weight for decades. The confession, partial as it was, refused to stay contained. It echoed in every corner of the building, in every whisper exchange between clerks and deputies, in the subtle stiffness of posture among those seated behind the bar. This was no longer about whether the past could be reconstructed. It was about whether the truth, once disturbed, could be restrained. The defendant remained seated, hands folded too tightly, jaw set as if bracing against impact. His earlier words had stripped away the last illusion of distance. He was no longer an observer of history. He was inside it, and history does not forgive hesitation. The prosecution adjusted instantly. Strategies shifted from accumulation to consolidation. They no longer needed to prove presence. That door had been opened from the inside. Now they focused on sequence, timing, the chain of decisions that led from one irreversible moment to the next. They introduced additional evidence, material that had been held back, waiting for exactly this fracture. Documents long archived, notes scribbled by detectives who never stopped believing, small corroborations that now landed with amplified force. Each piece clicked into place, not loudly, but with unmistakable precision. The defense tried to regain control. They argued coercion, emotional pressure, a man overwhelmed by decades of accusation. They framed the confession as a collapse, not a revelation, a psychological breaking point, rather than an admission of guilt. It was a careful maneuver, technically sound, but it struggled against momentum, because momentum had shifted. The jury watched differently now. Their eyes no longer searched for gaps in logic. They followed the emotional arc, tracking inconsistencies with sharper focus. Every statement was filtered through the confession's shadow. Doubt still existed, but it had changed shape. It no longer questioned whether something had happened. It questioned how much. Witnesses returned to the stand. Statements were revisited. Language once considered ambiguous now read as avoidance. Silence took on new meaning. Even the smallest gestures, hesitation before answering, averted eyes, felt suddenly louder. Outside the courthouse, the community absorbed the news in stunned fragments. Headlines struggled to keep pace. Social media erupted with disbelief, speculation, and anger. For years, the case had been an abstract wound. Now it had a pulse again, beating loudly, demanding attention. Families connected to the case felt the shift most acutely. For some, hope surged cautiously, fragile but undeniable. For others, fear replaced anticipation, because answers do not always bring peace. Sometimes they reopen doors best left closed. Inside the courtroom, time seemed distorted. Hours passed without sensation. The air felt stale, heavy with the weight of consequence. Every decision now carried amplified stakes. There would be no return to ambiguity after this. Then came the second crack. During cross-examination, confronted with a specific detail only the perpetrator could know, the defendant faltered again. This time, the pause was shorter, the resistance weaker. His response slipped, not fully formed, but precise enough to erase coincidence. A location, a movement, a choice. The prosecution did not press immediately. They let the implications settle, let spread quietly across the jury's awareness like a stain. That was when reality finally set in. This was no longer a case built on inference. It was unraveling from the inside out. The judge called for order as tension spiked. The defense requested another recess, urgency clear in their voices. The defendant stared straight ahead, expression hollow, as if the last remaining defenses had collapsed inward. When the court recessed, the corridors buzzed with restrained chaos. Legal teams clustered, whispering fiercely. Deputies stood alert. Somewhere in the building, a decision was being made that would reshape everything that followed. Because once a confession begins, it rarely stops where the speaker intends. The truth, once allowed even a narrow exit, pushes outward relentlessly. It demands completion. It rejects half measures. And as the courtroom doors prepare to open again, everyone present understood the same unspoken reality. The past had waited long enough. It was done being patient. When the courtroom reopened, the silence felt different. It was no longer the quiet of uncertainty. It was the quiet of expectation. Every person in the room sensed it. The fragile balance had tipped, and whatever followed would not be contained by procedure or protocol. This was a sound before impact. The defendant returned looking smaller, diminished by the weight of what had already escaped his control. His shoulders sloped forward, his breathing shallow. Decades of practice attachment had begun to fracture, and through those fractures, something raw and unstable pushed outward. The prosecution did not rush. They understood timing. This was not the moment for aggression. This was the moment for inevitability. They began calmly, revisiting details already entered into record, but now framed differently, not as questions of possibility, but as confirmations of reality. They walked the jury through the timeline again, not fast, not dramatic, just methodical, minute by minute, choice by choice, each step narrowing the space in which innocence could exist. And then they introduced a forgotten detail, a piece of evidence dismissed years earlier as inconclusive, a note in an evidence log, a physical anomaly at the scene that never fit any official narrative. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, in light of what had been said, it became unavoidable. The defendant reacted before he could stop himself. A subtle shift, a tightening of the jaw, the kind of involuntary response that no training can suppress. The jury noticed, the prosecution noticed, and they stopped speaking. Silence did the rest. When questioning resumed, the defendant tried to retreat. His answers shortened. His voice dropped. He claimed exhaustion, confusion, memory loss. But the pattern was clear now. He remembered selectively, and what he remembered aligned too closely with what only one person could know. The defense attempted to regain narrative control, objecting frequently, challenging phrasing, seeking technical refuge. But the emotional gravity had changed. Objections slowed nothing. They only highlighted the inevitability of what was unfolding. Then came the witness no one expected to matter anymore, a former acquaintance, a peripheral figure, someone overlooked for years because their testimony had never fit cleanly into the theory of the case. They took the stand with visible discomfort, aware of the attention suddenly focused on them. Their voice trembled at first, then steadied. They spoke of a conversation long ago, casual, forgettable at the time, a comment that seemed meaningless until memory reframed it, a remark about being in the wrong place, at the wrong time, said with a laugh that now felt chilling. The defendant stared at the table, his hands clenched. The room held its breath. That comment, once dismissed as hearsay, now echoed with clarity. It aligned with the timeline, the location, the detail that had slipped earlier under pressure. It was not proof on its own, but it didn't need to be. It fit. The jury leaned in. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were assembling themselves. Outside, the story spread rapidly. News vans multiplied. Reporters scrambled to verify details already leaking through unofficial channels. The community oscillated between disbelief and grim recognition. Names once whispered cautiously were now spoken aloud. Families watched coverage in silence. Some cried. Some sat rigid, unable to process what resolution might mean after so many years of unresolved grief. Justice, once abstract, had become dangerously close. Back in the courtroom, the defendant was called again. This time, his resistance crumbled faster. Questions that once drew deflection now produced hesitation. His breathing became audible. He wiped his face repeatedly, a gesture that betrayed rising panic. Then came the moment no one scripted. Mid-answer, he stopped, he closed his eyes. And when he spoke again, the cadence had changed. He didn't confess outright. Not yet, but he described the feeling, the pressure, the moment when control slipped. He framed it as an accident, a misunderstanding, a sequence that got away from him. But accidents don't hide for decades. The prosecution let him speak. They didn't interrupt. They didn't clarify. They allowed the contradictions to surface naturally. And as he spoke, the distance between explanation and admission collapsed. The judge watched closely. The defense sat frozen. By the time he finished, the room understood something critical. This was no longer about whether the crime had occurred as alleged. It was about how much longer the truth would resist being fully spoken. And as the court adjourned for the day, one reality settled heavily over everyone involved. The case had passed the point of containment. What came next would not be subtle. It would be definitive. Night fell hard over the courthouse, the kind of darkness that doesn't feel natural, as if it's weight, as if it presses down on rooftops and streetlights and the people still pacing the sidewalks long after the doors are closed. Inside, the air had changed. Outside, the city felt it too. This was no longer a trial unfolding quietly within four walls. This was a reckoning spilling outward, seeping into diners, living rooms, patrol cars idling at red lights. The cold case was cold no longer. It was burning. The defendant was taken back to holding without ceremony. No dramatic exit. No final glance. Just the sound of cuffs, the shuffle of shoes, and a man walking beside consequences he had outrun for decades. His words from earlier hung in the air, replaying in the minds of everyone who heard them. Not a confession, not a denial, something worse. An admission disguised as explanation, the kind that cannot be unsaid. Investigators stayed late. They always do when a case finally exhales. Files reopen again, not to search for answers, but confirm what was already surfacing. Every detail that once sat dormant now seemed louder, sharper. Notes written by detectives long retired. Photographs taken with outdated cameras. Evidence bags sealed with a kind of optimism that time would prove wrong. Until now. The overlooked clue returned to the center of the room. That small, inconvenient detail. The thing that never fit. The thing that had been waved aside. Because it complicated the story everyone wanted to believe. Tonight, it was no longer inconvenient. It was essential. It linked the defendant not just to the crime, but to the moment the crime crossed from chaos into intent. Analysts reconstructed timelines down to seconds. Who was where? Who could see what? Who had reason to lie? The defendant's earlier statements, once vague, now formed a pattern when placed side by side. He hadn't just remembered selectively. He had remembered strategically. Outside the courthouse, microphones waited for statements that didn't come. Law enforcement kept silent, and that silence spoke volumes. Reporters filled the gap with speculation, but beneath the noise was a shared understanding. This was not unraveling. This was tightening. In a quiet house miles away, a family sat around a kitchen table that had held the weight of this case for most of their lives. Photographs lay spread out, edges soft from handling, faces frozen in time, untouched by the years that had passed without answers. They listened to the news without speaking, afraid that hope might break if acknowledged too loudly. For them, this wasn't about legal procedure. It was about a voice they hadn't heard in decades. A laugh that lived only in memory. A future that had ended abruptly, violently, without explanation. Closure was a word people used carelessly. This felt nothing like closure. It felt like reopening a wound to finally see what had been festering inside. Back at the detention facility, the defendant sat alone. The bravado was gone. The practiced calm dissolved into something brittle. He asked for water, then for silence, then for a lawyer. His mind replayed moments he had buried deep, scenes he convinced himself were distant enough to no longer matter. But memory has a way of resurfacing when pressure is applied from all sides. Sleep did not come easily that night. Not for him, not for investigators, not for the jury members who would soon be asked to decide what truth looked like after 30 years of lies. Every ticking clock sounded louder. Every passing hour felt charged. Morning arrived without relief. When court resumed, the room filled faster than before. There was an edge to the crowd, a tension that hummed beneath whispered conversations. This was a day everyone sensed would change everything. The defendant took his seat again, eyes ringed with exhaustion, jaw clenched as if holding something back. The prosecution shifted tone. No longer patient, no longer exploratory. This was confrontation. They laid out the contradictions clearly, cleanly, one after another. Statements made years apart that could not coexist. Movements that placed a defendant exactly where he claimed not to be. Knowledge he possessed before investigators ever released it publicly. The defense tried to interrupt, tried to slow the momentum, but the momentum had become its own force. Each objection felt weaker than the last. Each redirection exposed more ground it could no longer defend. Then came the evidence enhancement. Technology had changed. What once looked like noise now revealed structure. What once appeared inconclusive now showed intent. Images sharpened. Audio clarified. Patterns emerged where randomness had been assumed. The past, filtered to the present, refused to stay silent. The jury watched as decades collapsed into minutes. The defendant shifted in his chair. His foot tapped. His hands trembled just enough to notice. He avoided eye contact, staring instead at the table, at the grain of the wood, as if it might offer escape. It didn't. A question landed that had no safe answer. Simple on the surface, devastating underneath. He paused too long. That pause echoed. He answered, but the words came out wrong. Not incorrect. Revealing. He corrected himself quickly, but the damage was done. The prosecution didn't need to press. They let the moment stand, suspended, undeniable. The room understood what had just happened. This was no longer about building a case. The case had built itself. When proceedings recessed again, the tension didn't dissipate. It intensified. Conversations buzzed. Reporters rushed to file updates. Phones lit up across the city. Social media filled with names, theories, anger, disbelief. The community, once fractured by uncertainty, now united by shock. Some felt vindicated. Others felt betrayed. Many felt both. That afternoon, investigators received a call. Not a tip, not speculation. A confirmation. A detail that aligned perfectly with what had just been revealed in court. A final reinforcement from an unexpected source. Someone who had stayed silent for years, believing their piece of story insignificant. Until now. It changed everything. By the time the court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. The prosecution requested permission to introduce new information. The judge allowed it. Carefully. Deliberately. The defendant knew before it was spoken. His shoulders slumped. What followed was not dramatic. No shouting. No collapse. Just a slow, unmistakable realization that the walls had closed incompletely. He stared forward, unblinking, as the truth finally stood where it could not be ignored. The past had caught him, and there was no running left to do. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had leaned in during the recess and decided not to move back. Air circulated, but no one seemed to breathe. The defendant sat rigid, eyes fixed ahead, not on the judge, not on the jury, but on some distant point only he could see. The new information hadn't been explosive. It hadn't needed to be. It slid into place like the final piece of a lock, quiet, precise, irreversible. The witness entered without fanfare. No dramatic walk, no spotlight moment. Just a person stepping forward after decades of silence, carrying the weight of something they had once convinced themselves didn't matter. Their hands shook as they were sworn in. The voice, when it came, was steady enough to be believed. They spoke of a night long forgotten by most, a detail dismissed at the time because it didn't fit the official narrative. A face seen briefly, a vehicle parked where it shouldn't have been, a sound that lingered too long to be coincidence. They hadn't known what it meant then. They only knew it felt wrong. And wrong has a way of aging poorly. The defense objected. Too late, the judge allowed the testimony, noting its relevance in light of newly corroborated evidence. The jury leaned forward. Pens hovered above notebooks. Forgotten. As the witness spoke, something shifted in the defendant. Not panic, not fear, resignation. The posture of a man realizing that silence had finally become louder than denial. He adjusted his cuffs, a small, almost unconscious movement, as if preparing for impact that had already arrived. The prosecution let the testimony breathe. No interruptions, no guiding, just facts laid bare, stripped of emotion, which somehow made them hit harder. The witness wasn't angry. They weren't seeking attention. They were doing what time had finally forced them to do: tell the truth. When the cross-examination came, it faltered. Questions circled the same ground, try and create doubt where clarity now stood. The witness didn't waver. They didn't embellish. They simply repeated what they had seen, what they had remembered, what they could no longer keep to themselves. That restraint was devastating. As the witness stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with restrained energy. The prosecution moved quickly, capitalizing on the momentum. They revisited evidence already presented, now framed through this new lens. Timelines aligned, gaps closed. The once theoretical became concrete. The defendant's earlier statements were read aloud again. This time, the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. What once sounded like confusion now sounded like evasion. What once passed as faulty memory now looked calculated. The judge called for order as murmurs rippled through the gallery. The jury was instructed to remain impartial, but faces told their own story. This wasn't about sympathy anymore. It was about recognition. During another brief recess, the defendant met with his attorney in hushed tones. The attorney's posture had changed. Less confident, more urgent. Pages flipped quickly. Options narrowed. The law allows many strategies, but it offers few miracles. Outside, the courthouse steps had become a gathering point again. Cameras waited. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder with strangers, drawn together by a shared need to witness history correcting itself. Conversations overlapped. Some spoke of justice. Others spoke of regret. Many spoke of how this should have ended long ago. Inside, the family of the victim sat together, hands clasped tightly. They had learned not to celebrate prematurely. Hope had burned them before. But something felt different now. Not victorious. Certain. The truth had shape now. Wait. Direction. When court resumed, the prosecution made a move no one expected. They requested the defendant take the stand. The defense objected immediately. The judge considered. The room waited. Seconds stretched into something unbearable. The objection was overruled. The defendant stood slowly, as if gravity had increased around him. He walked to the stand, each step echoing louder than it should have. He was sworn in. He sat. He looked out at the room, at the faces watching him, judging him, seeing him perhaps for the first time as he truly was. The first question was simple. He answered carefully. The second question built on the first. He hesitated. By the third, the cracks began to show. Small at first, a misremembered detail. A timeline shifted slightly. The prosecution pressed gently, methodically, like a hand testing a weakened structure. Then came the moment. A question about something only the perpetrator could have known at the time. Something never released publicly. Something the defendant had referenced years earlier, without realizing its significance. He froze. Silence filled the room. Not the quiet of patience, but the quiet of anticipation. Every eye locked onto him. The clock on the wall seemed to stop. He answered, and in that answer, he crossed a line he could not step back from. The prosecution didn't react. They didn't need to. The words hung there undeniable. The defense shifted uncomfortably. The judge made a note. The jury exchanged glances. The defendant realized it instantly. You could see it in his face. The tightening jaw, the flicker of regret, the understanding that the mask had finally slipped. The questioning continued, but the damage was done. Every answer after that felt defensive, explanatory, too careful, too late. When he stepped down from the stand, he didn't look relieved. He looked emptied, as if the act of holding the truth back for so long had finally exhausted him. The court adjourned for the day under a cloud of electricity. No one rushed out. No one spoke loudly. This was the calm before something irreversible. That night, the city barely slept. News replayed clips on loop. Analysts dissected every word. Phones rang with conversations people had avoided for years. The case was no longer just about the past. It was about accountability in the present. In a small room, alone again, the defendant sat on his bunk and stared at the wall. The silence pressed in. No lawyer, no strategy, just memory, raw, unfiltered, unforgiving. He had lived with this for decades. convinced time would bury it. He had been wrong. The truth had waited, and now it was standing right in front of him, refusing to leave. Morning arrived without relief. Gray light spilled through the courthouse windows, flattening the world outside into something cold and indistinct. The building filled slowly, deliberately, as if everyone since this day demanded caution. Conversations were hushed. Footsteps echoed too loudly. The air carried the weight of something unfinished. The defendant was brought in early. No conversation this time. No glances around the room. He sat with his shoulders slumped, hands folded, staring at the table as if it held answers it refused to give. Across the aisle, the family watched him with a stillness born of exhaustion, not hatred. They had imagined this moment too many times to feel surprised now. The prosecution rose and began without ceremony. No theatrics, no raised voice, just a steady march through facts that no longer stood alone. Each piece of evidence was revisited, not to reintroduce it, but to lock it into place. The witness from the day before, the slip on the stand, the detail no innocent person should have known. It wasn't dramatic. It was devastating in its simplicity. Timelines were projected, maps illuminated, a route traced again and again until it became unavoidable. The distance between the victim's last known location and the site where evidence was recovered, the window of time once considered too narrow. The assumptions that had protected the wrong conclusions for years. The prosecution spoke of mischances, of procedures that didn't exist yet, of technology still decades away, not as excuses, but as context, a reminder that truth does not expire just because it was inconvenient once. Then came the motive, long debated, long dismissed, reintroduced now with clarity sharpened by hindsight, a dispute that never made the papers, a connection buried under routine interactions, a reason small enough to be overlooked, yet powerful enough to destroy a life, the kind of motive that doesn't announce itself, the kind that festers. The defense stood slowly when it was their turn. The confidence from earlier days was gone. What remained was obligation. They questioned the reliability of memory, the dangers of retrospective certainty, the risk of letting emotion color judgment. Valid arguments, once, less so now. They leaned hard on doubt, but doubt had narrowed. It no longer filled the room. It clung to corners, thin and fragile. Each attempt to widen, it only exposed how little space it had left. When the closing arguments ended, the judge gave the jury their instructions. Clear, precise, heavy with responsibility. The jury filed out in silence, faces unreadable, carrying decades of unanswered questions with them into a locked room. Time slowed. Outside, reporters speculated. Inside, families waited. Every sound felt amplified. A door closing, a phone vibrating, a cough echoing too long. The defendant sat motionless, eyes forward, as if bracing for a verdict he had already delivered to himself. Hours passed, then more. In the jury room, discussions were intense but focused. No shouting, no grandstanding, just careful examination. Each juror weighed the same fact against different lives, different experiences, different thresholds for certainty. The past pressed in from all sides, demanding a decision had delayed for far too long. When the knock finally came, it felt unreal. The bailiff opened the door. The jury filed back in, faces set, expressions solemn. The courtroom stood. The foreperson held the paper with both hands. The judge asked a question that had waited 32 years to be spoken aloud in this room. The answer came steady, clear, impossible to miss here. Guilty. The word landed without drama. No gasps, no cheers, just a deep, collective exhale. The family closed their eyes. Some cried, some didn't. Grief doesn't follow a script. The defendant absorbed it quietly. No outburst, no collapse, just a nod, barely perceptible, as if acknowledging something inevitable. The mask was gone now. There was nothing left to perform. Sentencing was scheduled. Formalities followed. But the case, in every way that mattered, was over. Outside, the news spread fast. Headlines changed. Words like cold case were replaced with conviction. A chapter that had hovered unfinished over the community finally closed, though not neatly, not cleanly. That evening, the victim's name was spoken again in living rooms and kitchens, not as a mystery, not as a question, but as a person whose story had finally been believed. In a holding cell, the defendant sat alone once more. This time, there was no illusion of escape. The truth he had avoided now defined him, not as he wanted to be seen, but as he was. Justice had not been swift, but it had arrived. Night fell quietly, without ceremony, as if the world refused to acknowledge what had finally been set in motion. The courthouse emptied one shadow at a time. Doors closed, lights dimmed. The building that had held decades of silence exhaled and returned to stillness. But the town outside did not sleep. It couldn't. Too much had shifted. Too many questions had finally stopped echoing. In homes scattered across the county, televisions glowed late into the dark. The same footage replayed again and again. The same words crawled across the bottom of the screen. Arrest, conviction, cold case solved. For years, those phrases had felt theoretical, almost cruel in their distance. Tonight, they were real, heavy, final. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades now re-examined old memories through a new lens. Conversations once dismissed as harmless. Encounters that felt ordinary at the time. A face seen at the grocery store, at school events, at church. Familiarity turned sour. The realization cut deep. Evil had not arrived from the outside. It had lived among them, quietly, convincingly, for years. The family gathered in a small house that held grief like a second foundation. Photos lined the walls. Smiles frozen in time. A life pause in mid-sentence. They spoke softly, not about the verdict, but about memories. The way laughter once filled these rooms. The habits no one else remembered anymore. Justice had come, but it did not restore what was taken. It only stopped the bleeding from continuing unnoticed. For them, closure was not a door slamming shut. It was a window opening just enough to breathe. At the detention center, paperwork moved faster than emotion ever could. Form signed, instructions given. The defender was processed without ceremony, stripped of titles, reduced to a name and a number. The cell door closed with a sound too final to misunderstand. Concrete walls replaced a world he had navigated freely for decades. There were no speeches here, no explanations left to offer. Only time, endless, unforgiving time. In the days that followed, investigators revisited the case one last time, not to reopen it, but to understand it fully. They cataloged mistakes, missed opportunities, the blind spots created by the limitations of the era, not in shame, but in acknowledgement. Each failure became a lesson, etched into policy, procedure, training. The past, at last, was allowed to teach the future. New technology had cracked the silence, but persistence had carried it through. Boxes once shoved aside were now labeled resolved, a red marker drawn through a file that had consumed careers. Some investigators had retired. Some had passed on. Their work, incomplete in life, had finally reached its conclusion. The town began to move again, slowly, cautiously. Life resumed its routines, but not unchanged. There was a heightened awareness now, a collective understanding that time does not erase truth. It only buries it until someone is willing to dig deep enough. On quiet nights, when traffic thinned and the streets emptied, the memory of the case lingered like a low hum beneath everything else. Not as fear, but as reminder that justice can be delayed without being denied, that silence can fracture, that the past is never as distant as it pretends to be. The story no longer belonged to rumors or speculation. It had shape now. Wait, a beginning, a middle, and an end carved by patience and resolve. The name once spoken only in whispers was spoken aloud, clearly, without hesitation, not as a mystery, but as truth. And somewhere between the echoes of what was lost and the fragile calm of what remained, the community carried forward, changed forever, knowing that even after decades of darkness, a single hidden clue had been enough to bring the light back in.